On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, Saving Can Do, best-selling author Philip K. Howard unlocks the quandary of populist resentment and broken government. Nothing works as it should because red tape has strangled common sense. What's required is a multi-year effort to replace these massive, failed bureaucracies with simpler codes that are activated by people using their judgment. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Philip K. Howard. He is a leader of government and legal reform in America. He is chair of Common Good and a best-selling author. He's advised both parties on needing reforms, and I must say, every time I've talked with him, I've come off deeply impressed with his wisdom and his common sense. Welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
It's an honor to be with you again.
Let me start with your book, because you really go to the heart of what I think is one of the biggest challenges that we face. And you talk about the red tape problem really beginning in the 1960s. Why did that happen?
We woke up to all these problems that needed fixing, racism and pollution and unsafe cars and such. And the legal geniuses at the time not only thought we should change our values, which we did with civil rights laws, for example, but they thought that we should turn governing into a kind of a software program where no one could ever have bad values again. And so they got the idea that law shouldn't set goals and principles and guidelines. It should tell people how to make choices during the day. And then if there was a decision that had to be made, like, for example, whether to give a permit or not, that should be decided by objective proof after a neutral proceeding. And so now we have this ridiculous situation where getting a permit for a transmission line can take a decade or longer. The most offensive part of this was that we changed the idea of individual rights from being rights against state authority, like the First Amendment, government can't tell you what to say and such, to rights by any individual to use state authority to challenge decisions by other free people that they don't like. You can't fire me, that violates my rights, or you can't hold me accountable, that violates my rights. Well, wait a minute, what about my rights as your supervisor or whatever? So we created this crazy system designed to preempt human judgment, and we've been building it for 50 years.
And do you think that was a reaction to a sense that the kind of judgments that were being made by decentralized and local authorities, and had been since 1789, that somehow those were inappropriate and therefore had to be centrally defined?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically an effort to avoid all authority by local officials, by federal officials, by anyone. And, again, it would be sort of governing would be automatic. Just comply with the rules, just follow the process. And of course, it doesn't work that way. People end up gaming the process to get their own way. And it's gradually intruded into people's daily lives. The whole thing with wokeness and DEI was telling people how to talk to each other. Well, that's not a free society. Freedom doesn't require me to be polite to someone. Freedom allows me to be rude, and it allows you to judge me for being rude. Americans feel suffocated by it, and they are.
I think your book should frankly be a handbook for every person in the Trump administration and every member of Congress and their staff as they rethink this whole current government mess. You make the point that the Constitution is 7,500 words, and we currently have 150 million words in federal law and regulation. 150 million. That's almost incomprehensible.
Well, it is incomprehensible. And by the way, even artificial intelligence can't fix it because those 150 million words are internally inconsistent. It's not like some kind of, elaborate crossword puzzle. It's just a bunch of mandates stacked on top of each other. There's this whole thing called the abundance movement, where liberals were trying to persuade the Democrats to want to build more instead of just have a lot of process. And we can all generally agree with that. But those people seem to think that you can build more if you just prune this regulatory jungle. And you can't prune it because what's left over is mandatory. No, the way it's written is you must do this and you must do that. So you can cut out 8 must-dos and you're still going to have 800 other must-dos that somebody can complain about. So you really have to go back to a framework that's more like the Constitution, where they have principles like no unreasonable searches and seizures, and the courts interpret the principles. The system we built up has to be replaced.
You use the example, which I'm going to get to in a minute, of the Eisenhower interstate highway system. And I have to say, I recently went back because I'm trying to think about doing things in space, big infrastructure projects. So you can actually Google and pull up the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act. And when you look at how simple and direct it is and how much it delegates decision-making out of the government to the people who will actually build the railroad, it is an amazing variation on the way we currently do things. And I think what you described with Eisenhower is very similar.
Let's just have a thought experiment for a second. What are the odds that you could get permission to build a railroad line across the Rocky Mountains today? The odds are 0 because it has environmental impact. Well, guess what? Every project has environmental impact. The point is whether the benefits outweigh the environmental impact, but that's not how current law. So Eisenhower, for a number of reasons, including national defense, thought we needed a more integrated highway system. So the Interstate Highway Act was passed in 1956. It was 29 pages long. Within a decade, 21,000 miles of interstate highway had been built. The last Transportation Act was about 1,000 pages long, implemented by thousands of pages of regulations, and it would take more than a decade just to get permission to begin building part of a highway.
You see this also in this effort to lengthen the New York subway, which I think is about a 2.1 mile project, and which is currently estimated will cost 10 times as much as it would if it was being done in Paris. All of that's just additional unnecessary cost.
Right. So the New York Times, Ezra Klein, who's one of the abundance guys, tells the story of a public toilet built a couple of years ago in San Francisco. The public toilet itself costs, sort of installed toilet would cost about $200,000. It cost the city of San Francisco $1.7 million to put it in because of all the legal costs and the process costs. I've been trying to explore why, quote, affordable housing costs so much. So a small affordable housing apartment in Los Angeles costs, with subsidized interest and everything, $750,000. We're talking about a 1-bedroom apartment. $750,000. So how can that be? It's just standard stuff, right? Market rate apartments in Dallas cost 1/3 that amount. And the reason is because there's so much red tape that the lawyer's cost of just complying and then complying again, and then there are 4 or 5 sources of financing. They all require different lawyers to certify the same thing. So you have this crazy system of governance in this country where we have multiple levels of approval and paper forms to fill out and forms to check, and then people to check the forms that are being checked. It was killing our budgets. I mean, healthcare is another example. 30% of American healthcare costs is administration. That's $1.5 trillion a year. $10,000 per American family just in healthcare red tape. Now, couldn't that money be better used somewhere else?
Let me focus in on one of the things you mentioned, which is the whole environmental review thing. I know that Lee Zeldin at the Environmental Protection Agency has begun a pretty dramatic deregulation process. But in your mind, how would you measure what is and is not appropriate in terms of establishing a system of environmental review that actually had a bias in favor of construction?
So I think reform needs to happen in two dimensions. The first dimension, which liberals and conservatives fight about, is how much should be regulated, the scope of regulation, how many inspectors there are, all that kind of stuff, what the standards are for clean water. The second dimension, which no one is talking about, or almost no one except me, is how decisions get made. So for infrastructure, which I've done a lot of work on and testified for Congress on and such, for infrastructure, that requires giving an official, let's say someone who reports to the White House, the authority to make a judgment about what's important to study with environmental review. Instead of having a 3,000 or 10,000 page environmental review statement that takes 5 or 10 years to do, most projects probably have 3 or 4 big impacts. They could be studied in a matter of months in an environmental review statement that's 50 or 100 pages long. But that requires an official to make that judgment. And so you need to give officials the judgment to decide all these matters involving trade-offs, what's important and what's not. And then for the ultimate decision, the official has to have the authority, and again, accountable to the White House or some other official. Official has to have the authority to say, I believe that the trade-off of building the transmission line this way is worth the harm of building it through a pristine forest. That's not a legal question. That's a political question. And someone needs to have that authority. Today, no one has that authority. Remember in 2009, when Obama came to office, he got a stimulus from Congress, and they were going to use it to rebuild infrastructure, right? That was sold. We're going to stimulate the economy after this banking crisis by rebuilding infrastructure. Months later, Obama stood up and said, well, I guess we can't do that because there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. A famous phrase. Well, what would you have done? If you were president, Newt Gingrich would have said, hey, wait a minute, that's crazy. We're trying to stimulate the economy. Everybody wants infrastructure. Here's a 1-page law that gives me the authority to give permits on these terms right away. But President Obama thought that the legal system was like a state of nature, like a Himalayan range or something that you can't move. And so he just accepted failure.
To sort of paraphrase your work, which I've also seen in other books you've done, we have invented a system that grew up in a series of silos, with none of the silos really coordinated, in such a way that we have now become muscle-bound by the inability to actually act, and instead are caught up waiting endlessly for studies, for approvals, and as a result, we are steadily falling behind. It is impossible in the current American system to build the infrastructure we need.
Right. That's absolutely correct. And Xi Jinping and Putin are just sitting over there laughing at the paralytic democracy that we've created in the name of the rule of law. It's actually the opposite of the rule of law. Law is supposed to empower human judgment, not preclude human judgment. But we've created this crazy system. And so, my goal this year, with your help, I hope, is to build a new reform narrative that's based on re-empowering human judgment at every level of responsibility in society. Let the teachers run the classroom. Let the principals run the school. Let the official decide whether to give a permit and be accountable to the White House or some politically, accountable figure. This current system is failing because it's designed to fail.
It's designed to successfully achieve stasis.
Well, that's another way of saying it. Right.
As a result of which practical activity fails. One of the areas I'm currently writing is a paper calling for deregulation of NASA because in the 60 years since John F. Kennedy proposed going to the moon, NASA, like all good bureaucracies, has built up these layers of bureaucratic rules and regulations, which now makes it extraordinarily harder to innovate and to get into space. And my theory is that the administration should be able to go in and just literally take apart most of the regulatory overhang and recognize that they all represent a bureaucratic effort at risk avoidance and at minimizing responsibility. And as a result, places like SpaceX are making extraordinary leaps, but they literally are crippled by the complexity of the NASA regulatory structure. That's a perfect example of the sort of thing you're talking about.
Exactly right. There's a book called Reentry about SpaceX, where the guy who used to work for it goes into the details about how decisions are made in SpaceX to try different things compared to how the Lockheed Boeing procurement contract overseen by NASA works. We're talking about 100x less efficient for NASA, the Lockheed Boeing. Bureaucracy takes a life of its own. Every time there's a requirement, there's got to be a person to check the requirement, and then a person to check the person who's checking the requirement. And pretty soon you have this Amazonian jungle of red tape to open the door or whatever. So truly, this system of government, it certainly needs a spring cleaning. And the way to do that is have just a bunch of commissions in every area, NASA, everybody, and just say, let's reboot this. But it also needs a new operating philosophy. If people don't have the authority to cut through the BS, then the BS will just multiply.
So let me ask you about two different practical applications. One, if you were the president, what would you do to transition the executive branch to a can-do philosophy?
I would take a variety of areas, let's say anything, but you could take transmission lines or whatever, and I would either by executive order or try it or maybe go to Congress, but the order or the law would say, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, the approval process for transmission lines or whatever it is will be, for the next 5 years, will be this, and have a 5-line approval process that locates the authority to make trade-off judgments. It's like the Allies sailing around the Japanese in South Pacific in World War II. The way you get around the 150 million words of law is simply to ignore it all. You say, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary. You do it this way. And I would do that in one area after another. And without room for reasonable doubt, every area would work better.
Is there sort of a checklist or a training program for these new commissions?
Yeah, absolutely. The checklist would be restate everything that's needed and discard the rest as a recommendation. Create decision-making structures with authority to make trade-off judgments, including about the need for expedited decisions and all of that, so that you never get bound up in the paralytic sort of bollocks of somebody claiming you didn't comply with this or that, because you have authority to make trade-off judgments between this and that. And you do that area by area. The biggest area financially is healthcare costs. And I'm talking with people I'm sure you know, Mark McClellan, former head of CMS, some healthcare economists at Stanford, about what a simplified regulatory framework would look like for healthcare. So for most Americans, the growth of bureaucracy is a migraine headache. For people in healthcare, it's like the denial of human existence. I mean, they spend half the day filling out forms. And a lot of these requirements, like, for example, the idea of privacy laws in healthcare, well, privacy is a good idea, But the point of healthcare is to take care of people, not to be private. And so privacy should be a principle, not an obsessive regulatory regime that costs $100 billion a year. And it shouldn't authorize the Office of Civil Rights to attack hospital systems like Johns Hopkins because of foot faults in the way they administer privacy regulations. Who cares? You need to make judgments about what's really important in healthcare and not waste all this money. Again, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in things that are of marginal significance. And a special commission run by you and me could do that on healthcare. And it wouldn't take us very many months to do it.
That's the sort of thing that Mehmet Oz at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services would actually resonate with. I mean, he's smart enough, he understands the problems. And frankly, we probably can save more money on the administrative side than on the medical care side.
Without any question. And also just spring cleaning the kind of unnecessary regulatory oversight and such. I mean, you want doctors and nurses to focus on the patient, not focus on compliance with the law. I mean, I would love to work with CMS and run a kind of an outside committee that comes up with a simplified model of healthcare administration. It would liberate so many hundreds of billions of dollars.
I have a passion for getting back to a balanced budget, and you cannot even begin to think about it until you confront healthcare, because it's 18% of the gross domestic product and the largest single cost sector of the federal government. You just literally cannot solve our core problems until we get to a better model for healthcare. And I think you're right. A major, major problem is the regulatory paperwork. But let me ask about one other part of this. Don't the trial lawyers, in their desire to use all these regulations, don't they become among your most ferocious opponents?
Yes, there are a lot of people invested in the status quo. But the most pernicious of them are the trial lawyers who like the idea of suing people and collecting 40% of it, for keeping it for themselves, especially in healthcare, and the public unions. So with the public unions, I raised some money. I wrote a book called Not Accountable a few years ago, arguing that public union controls should be unconstitutional because they remove the authority of mayors, for example, to fulfill their constitutional responsibility. They come in, they're supposed to be in charge of the school system, and they have no authority.
That was the view of Franklin Roosevelt.
Absolutely right. So we are most of the way through organizing a constitutional challenge, which we're hoping that the Trump administration will bring against a couple of states to invalidate public union collective bargaining laws as an unconstitutional delegation of governing authority to a private group. So that's the way we're going to deal with that. Trial lawyers have a similar, I think, constitutional problem. You know, we've got a crazy system of justice where we let anybody sue for anything, and there's no law setting limits on who can sue for what. Well, every other country has law setting limits on who can sue for what, not America. So that has to be solved as well. When Obama was president, my not-for-profit Common Good had a joint venture with the Harvard School of Public Health to design a system of expert health courts that you supported, I remember. And we got everybody in healthcare, every legitimate interest to sign on, the patient rights groups, everybody, because it was going to be better for healthcare quality and reduce healthcare costs by a lot. We got President Obama to agree to it. They had a provision in the Affordable Care Act to do pilot projects for expert health courts. And the day before the vote, Harry Reid had the provision taken out at the bidding of the trial lawyers.
I think they are relatively invisible and amazingly powerful.
They give buckets of money. I mean, some of these guys are billionaires. There's just extortion. It's an extortion racket.
That's right. The way our current system is structured, it has nothing to do with justice and is essentially just a method of making money. It's really pretty staggering.
It's a kind of queen for a day thing, except instead of getting a washing machine, you get $20 million because of some human tragedy, and the lawyer keeps half of it.
I want to thank you for joining me. I think your new book, Saving Can Do, How to Revive the Spirit of America, is really important. I'm going to do everything I can to get it known in the Congress and in the executive branch. It's available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want to let our listeners know they can find out more about the work you're doing by visiting your website at philipkhoward.com.
Or commongood.org.
Or commongood.org. We'll make sure both are on our show page.
Great. I look forward to continuing working with you on this, Newt. Outside leadership by American leading citizens is what's going to make this happen. Politicians are too scared to take the lead until there's a movement going. So we need to start a movement to overhaul this system to make it work again.
Thank you to my guest, Philip K. Howard. You can get a link to buy his new book, Saving Can Do, How to Revive the Spirit of America, on our show page at newsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Gordon Z. Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.